If you've been a long-term viewer of my channel, you may be aware that I have a bit of an issue with following through to the end of a project. So when Ludum Dare 47 came along, I thought it would be the perfect excuse to force myself to go through with something right to the end, particularly if I streamed the work on Twitch, so as to shame myself into finishing. If you're not aware, Ludum Dare is a game jam where thousands of indie game developers from across the world are given a theme and have 72 hours to make a game with a team, or just 48 hours to make a game from scratch if working alone. All of my friends were busy, so I entered the compo, the 48-hour hard version. The theme was to be released at 8 AM in my local time, so I got up nice and early, made myself a cuppa, and went outside to enjoy the local Australian climate while I waited. Well, that's enough of this outdoor nonsense. Let's get to work. I started out by jotting down a few ideas, playing around with the idea of loops. I toyed with the idea of making some sort of circular maze game where the player would start in the middle and rotate the maze to try and escape, but eventually settled on a 2D side-scroller that would loop the player back around to the beginning of the level, as if they were playing on the side of a drum. To keep it interesting, each time the player went around the loop, something would slightly change, like the strength or direction of gravity, or the position of some key blocks, requiring the player to approach each level with new eyes. Now, I'm entirely insane and had decided that I would be making this game in JavaScript, using a library called P5.js that includes a lot of rendering functions to make my life easier. But if I'm honest with myself, the main reason was that I've just never used a proper game engine before, and JavaScript was the only way I could think of to make a game that worked in a browser. With that, I got a basic project set up, and got to work. Given that I was programming it from scratch, and that I ran down several misleading paths along the way, it took quite a bit longer than I'd hoped to get to the point where I had working 2D platformer mechanics. After about 6 hours of work though, I had a level that could be loaded from a small image and would infinitely scroll left and right by wrapping around. Next thing to work on was some of the other mechanics. I implemented a system of locked doors and collectible keys to unlock them, and worked out a way I could change the world constants like gravity from one loop to the next. In the end I only ended up reversing gravity on some of the levels, but the functionality is there for more. I implemented a teleport block that comes in pairs and will transport the player to the linked block, and a trap that will kill the player by setting their position back to the spawn point. I spent a bit of time working out how the positions of all of these blocks could be loaded in from the image, and then moved on. By this point it was getting quite late, but I still had some oomph in me, and so decided to tackle my first bit of artwork. Generally speaking, I have the art skills of a toddler armed with silly string, so I kept the graphics as simple as possible. The player character is simply a small blob with slight variations for moving and jumping. In what I truly believe to be the single stroke of genius I suffered in the creation of this game, I put the eyes on their own sprite, which allowed me to give the character some character by animating a little bob to the eyes. I moved on to create a cracked concrete texture for the walls, a door that could be tinted a given colour, and a likewise tintable keycard, because cards are rectangular and therefore easier to draw than keys. Door key pairs could then be tinted the same colour to indicate that one goes with the other. I decided to go for a laser for the trap, because once again, straight lines are easy. I did make a nasty looking laser emitter though, and a few sprites to have the laser animate in and out. Finally, I created the teleporter block, which you, if I didn't tell you, would have no idea was originally inspired by a Stargate. By now it was very late, and I had been awake for about 19 hours, having spent most of the day working. I wrote myself a to-do list for everything I needed to complete in order to finish the game, and collapsed into the sweet release of slumber. The next day, after oversleeping just a little, I launched into that to-do list by first breaking my map, and then fixing it with some extra space at bottom for a heads-up display. Implementing the HUD was relatively easy as there was already an underlying inventory system, and I just had to render any keycards into the extra space at the bottom of the screen in the right place. Next on the list was menus, so I threw together a kind of template, just a purple box where the game title would go and a big green Go button that would take the player into the game. I then realised that in order to get back to the menu from the game without restarting it, I should have an actual way to either win or lose the game. I made a new block type, which will win the game when interacted with, and take the player to another menu with some options to start again. As for losing, I just gave the character 5 lives to be reduced upon each death and lose the game if all lives run out. It was even easy to add a life meter into the HUD as a series of dots. By now, I was starting to get worried that while I had all of these mechanics, I didn't actually have a game yet, as I'd not designed my repeating and looping, though subtly changing, level. With that in mind, I continued to procrastinate it and instead make some graphics for the life counter, a red version of the player character. I also thought it was about time my game had a name, so I started brainstorming some ideas, writing down a bunch of different things about the game. I liked the idea of some kind of pun or portmanteau, but couldn't quite find anything that fit. In the end, I settled on what is essentially a nonsense word, blot. Kind of like an ink blot, but with an extra T, because I think it looks better. Pro tip, if you choose to name something a nonsense word, give it a Google anyway, as it might mean something in another language. Turns out that blot is apparently Norwegian for naked, in the sense of the naked eye, which kind of makes sense in our scenario, as the character is naked in the sense of having no tools, I guess, but that's probably pushing it. In any case, I couldn't find any reference to anything offensive, so blot it is. I decided to stylize it with 2 capital T's and played around with the logo until I found some effects I liked. I also changed the menu buttons to use a similar style and indicate when the mouse is over them. Another thing I implemented here was the ability to use multiple control schemes. Until now, I'd just been using WASD controls on the keyboard, but Ludum Dare is an international game jam judged by people from all over the world who may not have QWERTY keyboards. By letting players use arrow keys as well, the game becomes more accessible. So that's another few hours off the clock, and I really should get to work on level design. But then there's no point in having a good level if people don't know how to play, is there? I decided pretty quickly that my tutorial was going to be a kind of speech bubble that popped up and pointed at various things. It was actually pretty easy to implement, but I realised that having it pop up throughout the entire game would be really annoying. You only want it to show up the first few times you interact with something, and then not again. This took an embarrassingly long time to figure out, nearly another hour just to make the speech bubble go away at the right time. Plenty of time wasted. So then I rewrote my to-do list to move level design to the bottom, and made some more concrete sprites as I was getting bored of looking at the same texture over and over. I then spent some time detailing a ridiculous structure for how the level would be saved. For some reason, I latched onto my earlier idea of using an image, and thought it would be clever to use the red, green and blue channels of individual pixels in that image to tell my game what block to place where, in which loops, and in which configurations. This is probably my biggest regret of the whole process, as it's a needlessly complex way of doing something that could be done with a simple text file, and it cost me a lot of time when it actually came to the level design. Speaking of level design, at least by now I had the data structure, and so I could get stuck into it. So naturally, I ignored that and instead made some more character sprites to make a spawn animation, a teleport animation, and a death animation that I'm actually quite proud of. To finish off that section of work and a 10-hour long stream, I created and animated a little dynamite sprite that would be used to blast your way out of the loop and win the game. Then I went to get some dinner and have a long hard think about why I procrastinate so much. 8.5 hours on the clock, at 11:30 at night. I still had a massive amount of work to do, but I had fuel. I used a spreadsheet to help me sketch out the level design, and once I had something roughed out, I made the relevant changes to my image. That data storage system I was still for some reason invested in, this is where it bit me. Over the next 5.5 hours of iteration, going back and forth, making small changes, everything had to not only be pixel perfect, but to have exactly the right values in each of those 3 color channels. There was a time a few hours in where I honestly thought I wasn't going to be able to get it finished on time, as things were starting to go wrong and pixels seemed to be changing when I wasn't looking at them. I won't show the process here, partly because it was boring, but partly to avoid spoilers, but eventually I had 8 levels. Or rather, 1 level that is to be played in 8 slightly different ways. I created a pathetic animation for when you reach the bomb, but it is kind of charming in its terribleness, I think. On further reflection and some advice from the stream chat, I swapped out the 5 lives system for a timer. That way, instead of punishing a player with the rod of losing a life for not being good at the game, they are instead incentivized to get better with the carrot of a better completion time, in theory. I'm a clever boy and never once noticed that no one in my stream could see it, because the notebook camera is blocking it, but there is now a timer in the bottom right corner of the game. The game does still have issues. For example, since making Blot, I have learned about something in platformer games commonly referred to as coyote time, which allows for more forgiveness when making jumps. Also, one of the necessary jumps in the game requires Blot to be perfectly lined up with a gap that it's barely able to fit into, which is kind of frustrating to play. Aside from that, however, the game is, at this point, done. Aside from that, and audio, of course. 2.5 hours is not a long time for sound design, but I gave it a go. I used a tool that's commonly used for sound generation in game jams called SFXR, which semi-randomly generates noises, tones and chirps for game sound effects. I played around with it a bit, found some I liked, and processed some of them even further in Audacity before importing them into my project folder. I now had sounds for jumping, item interaction, winning the game, dying, and respawning. Great. Now for music. By this point I had 90 minutes till the deadline, which is nothing when it comes to music production. I was absolutely exhausted by this point, having worked through the night, and was seriously considering skipping the music and submitting the game as it was. I pulled through in the end though. Using a fun little music creation tool called Beepbox, I spammed down enough notes in enough of the right places and ended up with the music that you're listening to now. I recorded and exported the result, loaded it into the game, and after some volume adjustment and what I think to be the rather thoughtful addition of a mute button, the game was done. A little bit of artwork to make, then the itch.io submission, then the Ludum Dare submission, about 7 minutes before the deadline. I learned a lot during this game jam, and as exhausted as I was by the end of it, I have every intention to do another one, taking into account all the lessons I learned, like not inventing my own data storage algorithm on the fly. I had originally intended for this video to go up live a couple of weeks ago, but it's been the end of my university semester and I have been incredibly busy, so I'm only just getting to recording this bit of the video a few days after voting for Ludum Dare 47 has closed. This does mean, however, that I can share with you the results. Out of a total of exactly 800 compo submissions, Blot scored 390th. Not terrible, and to be honest, I'm just glad I got in the top 50% for my first jam. I'm sure I can do better though, I guess we'll just have to see next time. I'm somewhat surprised my highest scoring category was audio, considering how rushed it was, but I'm not even slightly shocked that graphics scored below average. I think these results are fair. If you would like to play the game for yourself, there is a link in the description to my as yet otherwise empty itch.io page where you can play the game for free. I've received one report that the game may not work on older browsers, but otherwise I've not been told of any game-breaking bugs. Leave a comment below and let me know your best time. Mine is 171 seconds, though I will admit I have an advantage. One last thing to mention, otherwise unrelated to the video, but this happened. Thanks, and thanks for watching.